On the afternoon, Kendria Lawson believed she had finally found her sanctuary. Standing on the steps of a cathedral draped in white orchids, her new husband, the undisputed king of the Jang Syndicate, handed her a legal envelope. The wedding march had barely stopped playing. The ink on the marriage registry was still fresh. Jang Minseok's gaze was like ice, devoid of the warmth he'd faked for months, as he told her their union was over before the reception had even begun. He didn't just want a divorce, he wanted her gone for the sake of another woman. By sunset, Kendria would realize the lethal reality of her new life. In the Korean underworld, a woman who knows the boss's secrets but no longer carries his name isn't just an ex-wife. She is a loose end that needs to be tied. If you want to see how Kendria transforms from a humiliated bride into the shadow boss who brings the Jang Empire to its knees, stay until the end. Hit that like button and comment below with the city you're watching from. Let's see how far this queen's reign reaches. The cathedral's stone steps had never seen such a display of opulence. Thousands of white lilies framed the entrance, their scent clashing with the smell of expensive tobacco and the metallic edge of hidden firearms. Kendria Lawson stood at the center of it all, her full afro crowned by a silver tiara that caught the sunlight, making her glow against the ivory lace of her gown. She was 24 years old, wearing a dress that cost more than the apartment she grew up in, and she had just tied her life to the most dangerous man in the country. Jang Minseok, a name whispered in boardrooms and back alleys alike. Kendria smoothed the silk over her hips, trying to calm the frantic pounding in her chest. The ceremony had been a masterclass in power, a public declaration that the Jang Syndicate was untouchable. 400 guests had watched. Half were politicians masking their greed, the other half were soldiers masking their scars. A city mayor had bowed to Minseok. A high-ranking general had offered a salute. And through it all, Minseok had played the part of the devoted husband with terrifying precision. For a moment, Kendria had actually believed the lie. "Mrs. Jang." The voice was low, belonging to Minseok's lead enforcer, a man whose tailored suit couldn't hide the predator underneath. "The boss is waiting for you at the top of the steps. He has one final vow to deliver." Kendria's stomach twisted. She'd known this marriage was a contract, a deal for protection and stability in a world that had always been cruel to her. Minseok had promised her a life where she would never have to run again, but as she looked up at him, standing there in his cream-colored suit, she saw the mask slip. The protection he promised was about to become her greatest prison. The heavy oak doors of the cathedral groaned shut behind her, the finality of the sound echoing like a gunshot in the afternoon air. Kendria stood alone on the topmost step, the silver tiara still pinned firmly into her afro, mocking her with its weight. Just minutes ago, she had been the most envied woman in the city. Now, as she descended toward the sidewalk, the white lilies lining the stairs looked less like wedding decorations and more like funeral wreaths. The transition from queen of the Jang Syndicate to a ghost happened with terrifying speed. As she reached the bottom of the steps, she saw the black sedan that was supposed to take her to the reception pulling away, the exhaust fumes swirling around the hem of her lace gown. There was no driver. There were no guards. The wall of men in tailored suits, the brothers-in-arms who had sworn to protect her, had vanished as if they had never existed. Kendria pulled her phone from the small silk clutch she had been allowed to keep. Her hands shook as she opened her banking app. The screen flickered, then displayed a cold, red error message. Account restricted. She tried her credit card at a nearby automated kiosk just to be sure, her breath hitching in her throat. Transaction declined. Minseok hadn't just ended the marriage. He had executed her financial life with a single keystroke. He had taken back the stability he had promised, leaving her with the gown on her back and the expensive perfume still clinging to her skin, a scent that now felt like a target. She began to walk. The city, which had felt like her kingdom this morning, was suddenly a labyrinth of predators. Every passing car made her heart hammer against her ribs. Every man in a dark suit was no longer a protector, but a potential reaper sent to ensure she didn't live long enough to become a scandal. Pedestrians stopped and stared. A bride, alone and disheveled, walking through the gritty industrial district that bordered the cathedral. She could hear the whispers starting, the social proof of her humiliation. Isn't that the girl who just married the Jang boss? What did she do to get dumped on the steps? The shame was a physical weight, heavier than the yards of silk dragging behind her on the dirty pavement. The pristine white fabric was already turning gray at the edges, soaking up the oil and soot of the streets, much like her reputation was soaking up the filth of Minseok's betrayal. She turned a corner into a narrow alley, her heels clicking rhythmically against the asphalt, a countdown to the inevitable. She stopped in front of a cracked window and caught her reflection. The woman staring back wasn't the glowing bride from the photos. This woman had tear-stained cheeks and eyes wide with the realization of her own vulnerability. She was a liability now. She knew the location of the Jang safe houses. She knew the names of the senators who took Minseok's blood money. The protection was gone. The money was gone. But as Kendria gripped the silk of her skirt, her knuckles turning white, a new sensation began to burn beneath the hurt. It wasn't the peace she had sought in the marriage, but a cold, sharp clarity. Minseok thought he had discarded a tool. He didn't realize he had just released a witness. As the sun began to dip behind the skyscrapers, casting long, jagged shadows across the city, Kendria Lawson stopped crying. She unpinned the veil, letting the lace flutter into a puddle, and kept walking. The fall was over. The survival had begun. The shadow of the syndicate reached Kendria before the men did. As she turned onto a wider boulevard, the rhythmic clicking of her heels began to sync with the low, steady hum of a black SUV crawling along the curb behind her. It was a predator's pace, deliberate, patient, and terrifyingly familiar. She didn't need to look back to know it was Minseok's security detail. In the world of the Jang Syndicate, there were no clean breaks, only controlled extractions. The vehicle lunged forward, swerving to block her path at the entrance of a deserted park. The doors didn't just open, they hissed, releasing three men in identical charcoal suits. At the center stood Dmitri, or rather, the man Minseok called his hand. He didn't look at Kendria with the respect he'd shown at the altar only hours ago. Now, his eyes were those of a repo man assigned to a high-interest debt. "Mrs. Lawson," Dmitri said, his voice a flat rasp that drained the remaining warmth from the air. The use of her maiden name was a calculated slap, a verbal confirmation that the marriage had been erased from the books. "The boss has revised the terms of your departure. You are carrying syndicate property." Kendria stepped back, her hand instinctively flying to the silver tiara nestled in her hair. "The wedding gifts. He's taking back the jewelry in the middle of the street." "The boss doesn't leave loose ends, and he doesn't leave assets in the hands of liabilities," Dmitri replied, stepping into her personal space. The two men behind him fanned out, their jackets flaring just enough to reveal the dark grips of their holsters. "The tiara, the diamond studs, the necklace. Give them over and you walk away. Refuse and we take them." Kendria felt a surge of pure, icy indignation. The jewelry had been the only thing she had left to sell, her only ticket out of the city. To hand them over was to accept a death sentence by poverty. But as Dmitri reached out a gloved hand, she saw the true nature of the trap. This wasn't just about the gold, it was about the humiliation. Minseok wanted her stripped bare, left with nothing but her skin and her shame. "He promised protection," she whispered, her voice trembling not with fear but with the first sparks of a brewing storm. "He promised protection to his wife," Dmitri corrected coldly. "You are just a woman who knows too much." With trembling fingers, Kendria unpinned the tiara. She felt the heavy diamonds leave her hair, the weight of the crown replaced by a chilling lightness. She handed over the earrings and the necklace, the metal still warm from her body. As Dmitri took the final piece, he didn't move away. He leaned in, his shadow swallowing her whole. "A word of advice, Kendria. Don't go to the police and don't go to the press. The boss let you live today because he thinks you're nothing. Prove him wrong, and we won't be asking for jewelry next time." The men retreated into the SUV, the doors sealing shut with a heavy thud. As the vehicle sped off, leaving her standing in the gutter of a city that no longer recognized her, Kendria realized the brutal truth. She wasn't just an ex-wife. She was a hunted woman. Minsiak hadn't let her live out of mercy. He had let her live to watch her wither. She stood in the silence, her neck bare and her heart hardened. They had taken his gold, but they had left her the one thing Minsiak had underestimated: her rage. The cold wind of the city's evening began to bite through the thin lace of Kendria's sleeves, but the chill on her skin was nothing compared to the sudden, blinding heat of the neon display above the electronics district. She had been walking aimlessly, her feet blistered and her mind a static hum of survival, until she looked up. A massive digital billboard, the kind that usually flashed luxury watches or high-end cosmetics, was dominated by a breaking news alert from the city's premier social chronicle. The headline, written in bold, shimmering characters, cut through the twilight: "A new alliance. Jang heir spotted with Han heiress hours after secret nuptials." Kendria froze in the middle of the sidewalk, ignored by the throngs of commuters who pushed past her ruined white train. The screen flickered to a high-definition photograph taken at an exclusive rooftop lounge, a place where the entry fee alone was more than Kendria's yearly rent. There was Minsiak. He had changed out of his cream-colored wedding suit into a sharp, midnight blue tuxedo. He wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking at the woman beside him with an intensity Kendria had once mistaken for love. The woman, Choi Hana, was the daughter of the rival Han conglomerate, the very empire Minsiak's father had spent decades trying to dismantle. She was the picture of old-world, underworld royalty, sleek, porcelain fair, and draped in emeralds that seemed to glow against her dark dress. In the photo, Minsiak's hand rested possessively on the small of her back, the same hand that had delivered the divorce papers to Kendria only hours prior. The betrayal was no longer a private wound. It was a televised execution. Kendria realized then that her entire marriage had been a tactical smokescreen. Minsiak hadn't married her because he wanted her. He had married her to distract his enemies and the press while he finalized a merger with the Han family. She had been the commoner bride, the public relations pawn used to soften his image before he solidified the most dangerous monopoly in the city's history. "So that's her," Kendria whispered, her voice lost in the roar of a passing subway train. "That's the reason I'm a liability." The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Choi Hana wouldn't just be his new wife. She was the missing piece of his empire. By choosing Hana, Minsiak hadn't just chosen another woman. He had chosen a side. And in that new world, there was no room for a black woman from the outskirts who knew the locations of the Jang family's private ledgers. The screen transitioned to a video clip of the pair entering a limousine, Minsiak shielding Hana from the paparazzi with a protective grace he had never truly afforded Kendria. As the billboard cycled back to an advertisement for expensive champagne, Kendria felt the last of her heartbreak harden into a cold, diamond-sharp resolve. She wasn't just a discarded wife. She was a witness to a crime of the heart that doubled as a crime of the state. Minsiak thought he had bought her silence with a wedding gown and a few hours of false hope. He didn't realize that by showing her the face of his true ambition, he had given her the one thing she needed to destroy him: a target. She looked down at her stained white dress, no longer seeing a symbol of her shame, but a uniform for the war that was about to begin. The neon glow of the billboard faded behind her as Kendria ducked into the narrow, rain-slicked veins of the wharf district. She needed to disappear, but in a gown that shimmered like a fallen star against the grime of the shipyards, she was a beacon for every bottom feeder in the city. The silence of the docks was broken not by the wind, but by the heavy, uneven footfalls of men who didn't care about the finesse of a syndicate tale. These weren't Minsiak's disciplined soldiers. They were the dogs of the East, a scavenger gang that thrived on the scraps the major families left behind. "Look at this," a voice rasped from the shadows ahead. Three men emerged from behind a rusted shipping container, their silhouettes jagged and lean. A lost little bird in a Vera Wang cage. Did Minsiok kick you out, or did you run away before he could break your neck? Kendria backed away, her heels catching on the uneven cobblestones. To her left and right, the alley was sealed by two more men. She was cornered, trapped in a circle of predatory grins and the metallic scent of cheap knives. The lead scavenger, a man with a jagged scar across his throat, stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the silver tiara she still clutched in her white-knuckled fist. Dmitri had taken the diamonds, but he had missed the structural integrity of the frame itself, a sharp, handcrafted spike of reinforced silver. "That crown looks expensive, sweetheart," the leader sneered, reaching for her throat. "Give it here and maybe we'll let you keep the dress." As his hand closed around her shoulder, something inside Kendria snapped. It wasn't the fear that took over, it was the cumulative weight of the day's humiliations. The public divorce, the financial execution, the televised betrayal, it all condensed into a singular, agonizing point of rage. When he lunged, she didn't scream. Instead, she swung the silver tiara with a ferocity that defied her slight frame. The sharp, decorative points of the silver crown tore through the leader's cheek, the metal biting deep. He howled, clutching his face as blood, dark and hot, splattered across the pristine white lace of her bodice. The sight of the red on her white dress didn't sicken her. It felt like a baptism. The other men hesitated, shocked by the sudden violence of the delicate bride. Kendria didn't give them a second to recover. She drove the jagged base of the tiara into the arm of the second man as he reached for a blade, the silver piercing through his leather jacket. She felt the resistance of muscle and the release of skin, a visceral reality that permanently severed her connection to the gentle woman she had been that morning. "Stay back," she hissed, her voice sounding foreign even to her own ears, low, guttural, and dangerous. She stood in the center of the alley, her afro wild and framed by the darkness, her wedding dress stained with the blood of her enemies. She looked less like a victim and more like a vengeful spirit born from the city's filth. Terrified by the sheer unpredictability of her transformation, the scavengers retreated, dragging their wounded leader back into the fog. Kendria stood alone, her chest heaving, the silver tiara dripping red onto the stones. She looked at her hands, smeared with the evidence of her survival. The girl who believed in sanctuary was dead. In her place stood someone who understood the only law the underworld respected. She didn't need a protector, she needed a weapon. And as she wiped the blood from her face with a piece of her torn veil, Kendria Lawson realized she was finally ready to play Minsiok's game. The sanctuary Kendria found was a derelict basement apartment, a space that smelled of damp concrete and forgotten lives, paid for with the last few crumpled bills she had hidden in the lining of her corset. Inside the cramped bathroom, the flickering fluorescent light hummed with a nervous energy that matched the rhythm of her heart. She stood before a cracked mirror, the blood of the scavengers dried into dark, stiff rust on her white lace. She reached for a pair of rusted kitchen shears she'd found in the kitchenette. The transformation began not with a word, but with the harsh, metallic snip of blades. One by one, the meticulously styled coils of her afro fell into the stained sink. She wasn't just cutting hair. She was shearing away the woman who had believed in Jang Syndicate protection. She was removing the beautiful black bride the media had paraded, leaving behind a silhouette that was sharp, aerodynamic, and unrecognizable. When she finished, her hair was a low, disciplined fade, a crown of a different sort, built for a soldier rather than a trophy. Next, she struggled out of the custom wedding gown. The fabric, once a symbol of her ultimate dream, now felt like a shroud. She dragged the heavy mass of silk and lace to the center of the concrete room, piling it atop the discarded veil and the broken silver tiara. With a strike of a single match, the lace caught. The fire roared to life, the expensive Vera Wang fabric melting into a foul-smelling black sludge. As the orange flames licked the ceiling, reflecting in her hardened eyes, Kendria felt the last of her grief evaporate with the smoke. As the gown turned to ash, The static in her mind cleared, replaced by a crystalline library of memories. She closed her eyes and began to sort through the months of her engagement. The dinners where Minsiok thought she was merely decorating the table, the late-night phone calls he'd taken while she lay beside him, and the maps he'd left unfolded in his study, assuming she lacked the intellect to read them. She remembered the name of the dummy corporation in Panama he used to bypass the hand conglomerate's shipping tariffs. She remembered the specific dates of the private audits at the Busan shipyard. Most importantly, she remembered the whispered mentions of a ledger kept by the syndicate's disgraced accountant, a man Minsiok thought he had exiled to the shadows, but whose location Kendria had accidentally seen on a decrypted GPS log. Minsiok had viewed her as a silent witness, a ghost in his house who absorbed nothing. He had forgotten that a woman who is ignored sees everything. Kendria knelt by the cooling ashes of her past and began to write on a scrap of paper, her handwriting steady and cold. She didn't need the Jang family name, and she certainly didn't need their mercy. She had the one thing more valuable than diamonds, the structural weaknesses of an empire. The fire died out, leaving the room in a heavy, charcoal darkness. Kendria Lawson stood up, her movements fluid and devoid of the hesitant grace of a bride. She was no longer waiting for the sun to rise on a new life. She was preparing to become the eclipse that would darken Minsiok's world. The liability had just become an architect. The damp chill of the basement lingered in Kendria's bones as she navigated the industrial outskirts of the city, her low-cut hair hidden beneath a dark, nondescript hoodie. She moved like a shadow through the district of rusted warehouses and forgotten shipping yards, the places where the Jang Syndicate threw away the things it couldn't kill but refused to acknowledge. She was looking for Jang Do-yun, the elder brother whose name had been scrubbed from the family records, with the same surgical coldness Minsiok had used to erase her. Do-yun's sanctuary was a hollowed-out repair shop that smelled of stale cigarettes and oxidized metal. When she stepped into the dim light of the garage, the man who emerged from the shadows was a jagged reflection of the groom she had married. Do-yun had the same sharp jawline and predatory eyes as Minsiok, but his face was a map of scars, and his gaze held the hollow exhaustion of a man who had already been through the fire Kendria was currently standing in. The church steps were all over the news, Do-yun said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp as he leaned against a workbench, a bottle of cheap soju in his hand. He didn't ask how she found him. In the underworld, desperation creates its own map. You're the girl from the scandal, the bride who lasted 2 hours. Kendria didn't flinch at the mockery. She stepped into the center of the shop, her posture rigid, her eyes reflecting the harsh overhead light. I'm the woman who knows where Minsiok hides his untraceable liquidity, Do-yun, and I'm the woman who knows why you were really exiled from the council. Do-yun's expression shifted, the drunken apathy replaced by a sudden, dangerous stillness. Careful, little bird. Knowledge is a heavy weight for someone who can't even afford a change of clothes. I don't want your pity, and I don't want a handout, Kendria countered, her voice steady and sharp as a blade. I want the keys to the back door of the syndicate. You were the architect of their original supply chain. You know the blind spots in the security at the Busan shipyard, and you know which captains are tired of Minsiok's arrogance. Do-yun looked at her, really looked at her, noticing for the first time the absence of her afro, the raw intensity in her gaze, and the way she stood as if she were ready to burn the world down just to stay warm. He saw a mirror of his own resentment, but tempered with a fresh, volatile ambition. He thinks he's playing a game of Go, Kendria continued, stepping closer until she was within his reach. He thinks he's secured the board by merging with the Han family. He's forgotten that the most dangerous piece isn't the one on the table, it's the one he threw on the floor. A slow, grim smile spread across Do-yun's face, the first flicker of genuine interest he had shown in years. He set the bottle down and reached for a set of blueprints buried under a pile of engine parts. Minsiok always was a fool for aesthetics. He thought you were glass, Do-yun murmured, his eyes igniting with a shared, vengeful fire. He didn't realize you were carbon, just waiting for enough pressure to become a diamond. The alliance was sealed in the silence of the garage. Kendria Lawson had found her teacher, and Do-Yun had found his weapon. The Afro Queen had made her first move, and for the first time since the wedding march began, the odds were starting to shift. The blue light of a battered laptop screen was the only thing illuminating Kendria's face as she sat in the corner of Do-Yun's garage, the smell of grease and ozone thick in the air. Before her father had gambled away their lives and before she had sought refuge in Minseok's hollow promises, Kendria had been a girl who found solace in logic and lines of code. She understood systems, how they were built to protect, and more importantly, where they were built to hide. While Do-Yun stood guard at the garage door, his silhouette a jagged line against the moonlit street, Kendria's fingers flew across the keyboard with a surgical rhythm. She wasn't looking for the syndicate's main payroll. That was too well guarded, a fortress of high-level encryption that would trigger alarms in Minseok's private security hub. She was looking for something more intimate, something Minseok had mentioned only once during a champagne-fueled dinner at the Grandeur Hotel, the dowry fund. It was a ghost account, an offshore shadow fund designed to move the bride's assets under the syndicate's umbrella while remaining untraceable to the tax authorities. Minseok had intended it to be her gilded cage, a fund that would pay for her dresses and her silence. But he had made the fatal mistake of letting her see the login sequence on his tablet while he thought she was admiring her engagement ring. She bypassed the first layer of the firewall using a backdoor exploit she had coded years ago during her university days. The digital walls of the Jang Empire began to peel back, revealing the rot underneath. She found it tucked away in a server in the Cayman Islands, a slush fund labeled Protocol Orchid. The balance at the bottom of the screen made her breath hitch. It was enough to buy a dozen lives. It was the safety Minseok had promised her, translated into cold, digital digits. But as she stared at the numbers, Kendria didn't feel the relief of a victim finally finding a way out. She felt the predatory thrill of a hunter. "I'm in," she whispered, the reflection of the shifting code dancing in her eyes. "Can you move it?" Do-Yun asked, his voice coming from the darkness. "If I move it all at once, his auditors will see the bleed out in seconds," Kendria replied, her jaw tightening. "I'm going to siphon it. Small, untraceable increments routed through a dozen shell companies. By the time he realizes the dowry is empty, the money will already be working against him." She executed the first transfer. The screen flickered as the digital currency began its journey through the global financial plumbing, shedding its Jang family skin and emerging as clean, untraceable power for her own cause. Every cent she took felt like a pound of flesh reclaimed from the man who had abandoned her on the church steps. Minseok had stripped her of her jewelry, her name, and her dignity, believing he had left her with nothing. He didn't understand that by leaving her with her mind and his passwords, he had handed her the very scalpel she would use to dissect his empire. Kendria closed the laptop, the darkness of the garage swallowing her once more. The bride was officially off the ledger. The thief had just arrived. The neon pulse of the Iron Lotus was hidden 3 floors beneath a legitimate seafood packing plant, a place where the scent of brine masked the heavy aroma of high-stakes desperation and expensive scotch. Kendria moved through the smoke-filled cavern not as the bride in lace, but as a phantom in a sharp, slate-gray power suit that complemented her low-tapered hair. The stolen digital currency from the Orchid Protocol had been washed through a dozen offshore filters and was now sitting, heavy and ready, in a secure cold wallet at her hip. She didn't head for the baccarat tables or the private poker dens. She headed for the pit, a dimly lit lounge at the back where the syndicate's mid-level enforcers gathered to complain about their shrinking commissions. These were the men who did the bleeding for the Jang family, while Minseok sipped vintage cognac with the Han heiress. As she stepped into the light of the lounge, the conversation died. The men froze, their eyes widening as they recognized the woman from the headlines, The discarded wife, they had been told, was a nonentity. But the woman standing before them didn't look like a victim. She looked like a predator who had found a better forest. "I hear the merger with the Han family comes with a new set of rules," Kendria said, her voice cutting through the low hum of the casino with the precision of a diamond saw. She didn't wait for an invitation. She sat at the head of their table, her presence commanding the air. "I hear Minseok is cutting the street-level bonuses to pay for Choi Hana's new security detail. I hear the men who built this empire are being treated like seasonal labor." A heavy-set man with a scarred brow, a veteran enforcer named Park who had served the Jangs for 15 years, narrowed his eyes. "You've got a lot of nerve showing your face here, Lawson. Minseok's hand is long. He'll have your head for even thinking my name." "Minseok's hand is full," Kendria countered, leaning forward until the blue light of the laptop she placed on the table reflected in Park's wary eyes. "He's too busy playing house with a conglomerate princess to notice that his loyalty is leaking. You've given him 15 years, Park. And what did he give you when the Han family complained about your crude methods? A demotion to the docks." She turned the screen around. It showed a series of encrypted transfers, bonuses, untraceable and immediate, already sitting in the private accounts of every man at the table. It was more than they made in a year of dirty work. "That's just the down payment," Kendria whispered, her gaze locking onto each man in turn. "Minseok thinks he discarded a liability. He didn't realize he discarded the only person who knows exactly how to pay his soldiers what they're actually worth. I don't want your hearts. I want your eyes and your ears. When the time comes to choose between a boss who forgets his roots and a woman who remembers his secrets, I expect you to remember who filled your pockets tonight." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of shifting allegiances. Park looked at the screen, then at the low-cut hair and the cold, calculated fire in Kendria's eyes. He saw a leader who understood the currency of the street better than the man currently sitting in the penthouse. Slowly, he reached out and closed the laptop, a silent vow of treason. The underworld market had opened, and for the first time in history, the Jang Syndicate was being bought out from the inside. The penthouse of the Han estate was a fortress of glass and ivory, a place where Choi Hana prepared for her upcoming nuptials with the serene confidence of a woman who had never known a day without power. She sat at her vanity, her reflection framed by the emeralds that were now the talk of the city, until her personal assistant entered, carrying a small, unmarked box wrapped in black silk. There was no card, only a scent, the faint, unmistakable aroma of white lilies, the very flowers that had lined the steps of the cathedral where Kendria Lawson had been discarded. Hana opened the box with a practiced indifference that vanished the moment she saw the contents. Inside was not a jewel, but a series of high-resolution photographs and a sleek, silver flash drive. The first photo was of Minseok, but he wasn't with Kendria, and he wasn't with Hana. He was in a private villa in Jeju, his arm around a woman whose face was known only to the syndicate's inner circle, the wife of the very general whose support the Han family needed to secure their merger. The evidence didn't stop at infidelity. As Hana plugged the drive into her laptop, a file titled The Ledger of Glass opened. It was a meticulous record, compiled with the sharp logic of a woman who had spent months as a silent observer, detailing how Minseok had been siphoning funds from the Han conglomerate's shared shipping routes long before the engagement was even announced. It showed that the alliance wasn't a partnership of equals, it was a parasitic takeover. Minseok wasn't bringing the Jang Syndicate to the Han family to strengthen them. He was using the Han family as a shield while he dismantled their assets from within. Attached to the end of the files was a single voice recording. It was Minseok's voice, cold and stripped of the romantic facade he had used on both women. "The Han girl is a necessity for the board," he told an unknown associate. "Once the signatures are dry and the accounts are merged, she'll be as disposable as the one before her. A crown is only heavy if you let the person wearing it stay alive." Hana's hand trembled, the emerald on her finger suddenly feeling like a cold, heavy shackle. She looked at the final item in the box, a single, charred piece of white lace from Kendria's wedding gown. It was a warning from a ghost, a message from the woman Minseok thought he had destroyed, reaching out from the ashes to show the new bride the true shape of her future. Miles away, in the dark corner of the Iron Lotus, Kendria watched a small notification light up on her phone. The file had been accessed. The seed of doubt had been planted in the one place Minseok felt most secure. She didn't need to storm the palace to start the fire. She only needed to hand the match to the person standing closest to the curtains. Kendria leaned back into the shadows, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. The uninvited guest hadn't shown up in person, but her presence was now the only thing Choi Hana would see when she looked at her groom. The rise was no longer just about survival. It was about the exquisite, calculated dismantling of a king's peace. The Jang Syndicate's dominance was built on the rhythmic, mechanical certainty of its supply chains, but by the third week of the Han merger, that rhythm began to stutter. It started at the Incheon terminal, a midnight shipment of high-grade electronics that simply never arrived. The manifest was perfect, the GPS pings were active, and the guards were veterans, but when the containers were opened, they were filled with nothing but industrial salt and a single, pressed white lily. Minseok's empire was bleeding, and the hemorrhage was silent. One by one, the vital arteries of his business, the shipping routes he had spent a decade securing, were being hijacked by a ghost. From the dark waters of the Busan Straits to the logistics hubs in Seoul, the story was always the same. His soldiers didn't fight back because, by the time they realized a hit was happening, their own communications had been jammed by a superior signal. The mysterious Black Lady boss, as the dockworkers began to whisper in the dive bars, seemed to know Minseok's schedule better than his own captains. She knew the exact moment the Coast Guard shifted patrols. She knew which port officials were susceptible to a higher bribe and which ones could be moved by the threat of their private bank records being leaked. She wasn't just stealing cargo, she was stealing the infrastructure of his power. In the operations room of a nondescript warehouse in the outskirts, Kendria sat surrounded by a bank of monitors, her low-cut hair sharp and modern against the glow of the data streams. Beside her, Do-yun pointed to a flickering map of the coast. "The Han family is screaming," Do-yun remarked, a grim satisfaction in his voice. "They put up 40% of the capital for the new northern route. Now that the last 3 ships have been diverted to our private berths, they're starting to ask Minseok why his impenetrable security looks like a sieve." Kendria didn't look up from the screen. Her fingers moved with cold, calculated precision, authorizing another payout to the enforcers she had flipped at the Iron Lotus. "Minseok is a strategist of optics, Do-yun. He understands how things look on a stage. I understand how they work in the dark. He's looking for an army in the streets, so he's missing the coup happening in his ledgers." The brilliance of Kendria's campaign lay in its invisibility. She wasn't using the brutal, loud methods of a traditional mafia war. She was executing a corporate hostile takeover dressed in the clothes of a street heist. Every route she hijacked didn't just hurt Minseok's wallet, it shattered his reputation for invincibility. The Han family's trust was a fragile thing, built on the promise of the Jang Syndicate's strength. Without the shipping routes, Minseok was just a man in an expensive suit holding a broken contract. As a fourth ship, a massive freighter carrying the Han conglomerate's latest tech exports, slowly veered off its charted course and toward a private dock owned by a shell company Kendria controlled, she finally leaned back. The Black Lady wasn't a myth. She was the inevitable consequence of Minseok's arrogance. He had thrown away a woman who knew his foundation, and now that woman was taking the house. The silent coup was nearly complete, and the city was beginning to realize that the king's crown was being sold off, piece by piece, right from under his nose. The silence of the Jang Syndicate's high-rise headquarters was no longer the silence of discipline. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet of a fortress under siege by an invisible enemy. Jang Minseok stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, his reflection ghosting against the sprawling lights of the city he supposedly ruled. He had traded his wedding cream for a suit the color of a bruised sky, but the sharp lines of his tailoring couldn't hide the tension radiating from his shoulders. In just 2 weeks, the impenetrable logistics network that underpinned his merger with the Han family had been decimated. 4 major shipments had vanished into the ether. 3 high-level distributors had gone dark. And this morning, his primary offshore accounts had reported a technical discrepancy that looked suspiciously like a slow, deliberate drain. "Report," Minseok commanded, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. Dmitri stepped into the light, his usually stoic face tight with frustration. "The Han family elders are calling for an emergency council, boss. They believe the Kims are behind the hijacking. The precision of the hits. They say only a rival clan with decades of internal intel could bypass our encryption this cleanly." Minseok's jaw tightened. "The Kims are bold, but they are loud. These hits are surgical. They aren't just taking the cargo, they're taking the routes. They're playing a game of Go while we're looking for a street fight." He turned away from the window, his eyes dark with a cold, focused fury. "They think they can bleed me out before the merger is finalized. They want the Han family to see me as a weak link." He paced the room, his mind racing through a list of enemies, rival bosses, disgruntled board members, even corrupt generals he'd failed to bribe enough. He analyzed every threat with a strategist's eye, calculating the reach of every man who had ever crossed him. But in all his calculations, he never once looked toward the basement apartments of the industrial district. He never once considered the woman he had left on the cathedral steps. To Minseok, Kendria Lawson was a closed book, a discarded piece of trash that the city's currents had surely swept away by now. He had stripped her of her money, her name, and her protection. In his world, a person without those things simply ceased to exist. "Double the guards on the Busan terminal," Minseok ordered, slamming his hand onto his mahogany desk. "If the Kims want a war of attrition, I'll give them a massacre. They think they've found a ghost in the system, but I'll find the man behind the curtain and I'll hang him from his own crane." Dmitri nodded and withdrew, leaving Minseok alone with his mounting rage. He poured a glass of vintage scotch, the amber liquid trembling slightly in his hand. His arrogance was his greatest armor, a shield that kept him convinced of his own invincibility. It was that same armor that prevented him from seeing the truth, that the ghost wasn't a rival king but the queen he had tried to execute. He was looking for a clan, while a single woman was dismantling his throne, one brick at a time. The price of his arrogance was being tallied in the dark, and for the first time in his life, Jang Minseok was the only one in the room who didn't know he was already bankrupt. The stone steps of the cathedral were cold, holding the residual dampness of a city that had forgotten how to be kind. Kendria stood exactly where she had been 6 weeks ago, but the woman in the ivory lace was gone. In her place stood a figure in a sharp, obsidian-colored trench coat, her low-cut hair shimmering like velvet under the moonlight. She didn't carry flowers this time. She carried a burner phone and the weight of a dying empire. The roar of a high-powered engine signaled his arrival. A silver sedan screeched to a halt at the curb and Jang Minseok stepped out. He looked haggard, the polished perfection of his image frayed by weeks of invisible warfare. He had come alone, driven by the desperation of a man whose bank accounts were emptying and whose allies, the Han family, had turned into silent executioners. He still didn't know who he was meeting. The message had simply said, "I have the ledger. Meet me where you broke the contract." Minseok ascended the stairs, his hand resting on the grip of the pistol tucked into his waistband. He stopped 10 feet below her, his eyes squinting against the glare of the cathedral's floodlights. When he finally recognized the silhouette, his face didn't register fear, only a profound, arrogant confusion. "Kendria," his voice was a rasp stripped of its kingly resonance. "You've been behind this, the shipping routes, the Han leaks. You're the Black Lady." "I'm the liability you forgot to liquidate, Minseok," she said, her voice steady and echoing off the stone arches. She didn't move as he took another step upward. You thought I was a chapter you could just tear out of the book. You forgot that I was the one holding the pen. You think this is a game, Minciok snarled, his pride flaring even as his world crumbled. You've cost me millions. You've embarrassed the Jang name. I gave you a life of luxury and you repay me with treason. You gave me a cage and called it a kingdom, Kendria countered. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small remote. I didn't call you here for an apology. I called you here for the final negotiation. The Han family has already seen the Kochedu, Inus, Jeju files. Your board of directors has already received the proof of your embezzlement. By dawn, the Jang Syndicate will have a new head, and it won't be a man who breaks his word for a conglomerate's dowry. Minciok pulled his weapon, the barrel leveled at her heart. I'll kill you before I let a discarded girl take what I built. Kendria didn't flinch. She looked down at him with a pity that cut deeper than any blade. Look around you, Minciok. Your men aren't coming. Dmitri isn't coming. I bought their loyalty with the money you thought was yours. You're standing on the same steps where you told me I was nothing. Now look at us. She pressed a button on the remote, and the cathedral's massive bells began to toll, a deafening, rhythmic chime that signaled the end of an era. From the shadows of the pillars, the flash of red and blue lights began to approach, not the police, but the internal security of the Han conglomerate, coming to collect the man who had defrauded them. The contract is closed, Minciok, she whispered over the roar of the bells. And this time, I'm the one signing the papers. The sirens faded into the background, replaced by the heavy, rhythmic thud of combat boots on stone. The men emerging from the shadows were not the Han conglomerate's security, nor were they the rival Kims. They were the gray-haired titans of the Jang Syndicate, the Council of Elders, led by the very man Minciok had spent his life trying to surpass. At their center stood Do-Yun, no longer the scarred mechanic in a grease-stained garage, but a man restored to his rightful place, flanking the woman who had made his resurrection possible. Minciok stood frozen, his pistol still aimed at Kendria, but his hand was trembling. The red dots of several sniper scopes danced across his chest, centered with lethal precision. Elders, Minciok managed to choke out, his voice cracking. This woman is a thief. She has compromised our roots. She has siphoned our capital. I was just about to. You were about to murder the only person who has shown more tactical brilliance in 6 weeks than you have in 6 years, the head elder interrupted, his voice like grinding stone. He stepped into the light, casting a look of profound disappointment at his former successor. We do not value loyalty to a man who loses his empire to a ghost. We value the ghost who is clever enough to take it. Kendria stepped forward, descending the stairs until she stood eye level with the man who had abandoned her. She held out a leather-bound folder, the physical manifestation of his demise. The board of directors didn't just see your embezzlement files, Minciok. They saw a better offer. I used the Orchid Protocol funds to buy out their private debts. I didn't just steal your money. I bought your people. Every vote on the council now belongs to me. Minciok looked around wildly, his gaze landing on the faces of the men he had led. They looked through him as if he were already a memory. The realization finally pierced his arrogance, a cold blade of truth that left him breathless. He wasn't being arrested by the law, he was being erased by his own kind. You can't do this, Minciok whispered, the gun slipping from his fingers and clattering onto the stone. A woman, a foreigner, the elders would never. The elders care about the bottom line, Minciok, Kendria interrupted, her voice devoid of heat. And your bottom line is zero. You broke the most sacred contract of the underworld. You underestimated your partner. You thought I was a chapter, but I was the foundation. And when you pulled me out, the whole house fell. The head elder stepped forward, placing a heavy hand on Do-Yun's shoulder. Jang Minciok, you are stripped of your name and your rank. You will leave this city tonight with nothing but the clothes on your back, the same mercy you showed your bride. If you are seen within the city limits after dawn, the contract on your life will be open to the highest bidder. Kendria watched as the syndicate guard stepped forward to escort the broken man away. He didn't look back. He couldn't. He was a ghost now, walking the same path of invisibility he had once sentenced her to. She stood on the cathedral steps, the wind whipping through her coat, her silhouette sharp and unbreakable. The checkmate was complete. The king was off the board, and the woman with the silver tiara had finally claimed the game. The sun rose over the city, casting long, golden fingers across the marble floors of the Jang family estate, but the light didn't bring the warmth of a new day. It brought the cold, sharp clarity of a new era. In the grand study where Minciok had once signed the orders to discard her, Kendria sat in the high-backed leather chair. She was dressed in a suit of charcoal silk, its structured shoulders a far cry from the delicate lace she had worn when she first entered these walls. She looked at the mahogany desk, now cleared of Minciok's vanity projects and replaced by a trio of sleek monitors and a single, silver-framed photograph of the cathedral steps, not as a reminder of her pain, but as a monument to the moment her true life began. Beside it sat the silver tiara, its frame straightened and polished, the blood of the scavengers scrubbed away. It wasn't a wedding accessory anymore. It was a relic of the war she had won. A soft knock at the door preceded Do-Yun, who entered with the silent deference of a man who knew exactly who held the reins of the city. He placed a tablet on the desk, the screen displaying the finalized merger, not with the Han family, but a complete absorption of their shipping routes into a new conglomerate, Lawson Strategic. The Han family has signed the dissolution papers, Do-Yun reported, his voice steady. Choi Hana has retreated to her family's estate in Jeju. She sent a message. She thanked you for the gift that saved her life. Kendria nodded slowly, her fingers tracing the edge of the silver tiara. She was a prisoner of the same fairy tale I was, Do-Yun. The only difference is I burned the book to stay warm. The estate, once a place of carefully contained violence and secrets, now hummed with a different frequency. The guards in the halls no longer looked at her with the dismissive pity reserved for a mafia wife. They looked at her with the terrifying respect earned by a CEO of the shadows. She had dismantled the old guard and rebuilt it in her own image, efficient, data-driven, and ruthlessly loyal to the person who controlled the ledger. She stood and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the sprawling metropolis. Somewhere out there, Minciok was a ghost, a man without a name, learning what it felt like to be a liability in a world that only valued assets. She felt no triumph in his suffering, only a profound, quiet sense of justice. She had been discarded like a broken tool, but she had forged herself into a master key. Kendria Lawson was no longer the bride with the shattered dream. She was the architect of the city's new order, the woman who had turned a crown of thorns into a throne of steel. She had sought protection and found power. She had sought a home and built an empire. As the city below woke up to a world she now shaped, Kendria allowed herself a single, fleeting smile. The game was over, and the winner had never looked better in black. She wasn't just surviving the shadows anymore. She was the one who cast them. I hope you enjoyed this story. Please like and subscribe to see more stories like this. See you in my next video.